There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a grand house when death visits it. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but a heavy, suffocating stillness that presses against the walls and seeps into the bones of every person who walks the corridors. That was the silence that blanketed Ashworth Hall on the morning of October the 14th, 1842, when the household prepared to bury Eleanor Catherine Ashworth, Duchess of Lenfield, aged only 23. But Eleanor was not in the coffin. She was standing at the back gate of her own estate, dressed in the rough woolen clothes of a scullery maid, with dirt rubbed deliberately into her fingernails, and her copper-colored hair tucked beneath a servant's cap. Her heart was hammering so hard, she could feel it in her teeth. She carried a forged letter of reference in her apron pocket, and a single brass ring sewn into the hem of her skirt, and she had exactly one chance to walk through that gate and into the funeral without being recognized by the man who had tried to kill her. To understand how a duchess ended up disguised at her own burial, you have to go back 14 months, to the summer of 1841, when Eleanor Caldwell was not yet a duchess at all. She was the second daughter of a country physician in the small coastal village of Harrowden, a place so unremarkable that even the mail coach only passed through it twice a week. Eleanor spent her days helping her father prepare tinctures and salves, her fingers perpetually stained with the yellow of turmeric root and the deep violet of elderberry. She could set a broken bone before she could properly dance a waltz. She smelled of camphor and lavender, and she had never in her life owned a pair of gloves that didn't have ink stains on the fingers. The young Duke of Lenfield, Thomas Ashworth, arrived in Harrowden on a Tuesday in June, with a dislocated shoulder and a bleeding gash above his left eye, thrown from his horse on the cliff road after a wheel from a passing cart had spooked the animal. He was 26 years old, broad across the shoulders, but surprisingly gentle in his manner, and when Eleanor's father pushed his shoulder back into its socket without warning, Thomas didn't scream. He simply went very white, gripped the edge of the examination table until his knuckles matched the color of his face, and said in a remarkably steady voice, "I do hope that was the worst of it." Eleanor, who had been holding a cloth to the wound above his eye, laughed before she could stop herself. It was a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and Thomas looked up at her with an expression of such surprised delight that her father noticed it immediately and quietly left the room to fetch unnecessary supplies. What followed was not the grand, sweeping courtship that novels are made of. Thomas returned the next day to have his wound redressed, which was medically unnecessary but socially very effective. He returned the day after that with a book he claimed Eleanor's father had recommended, which her father had not. He returned the day after that with no excuse whatsoever, simply standing in the doorway of the physician's cottage with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that said he had completely run out of pretexts and was now relying entirely on honesty. Eleanor invited him in for tea. They talked for 4 hours. He missed his dinner engagement in the next county and did not care even slightly. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Eleanor walked the cliff paths above Harrowden nearly every evening. He told her about the enormous, echoing loneliness of Ashworth Hall, how he had inherited the estate at 19 after his father's sudden death, and had spent the last 7 years feeling like a boy wearing a grown man's coat. She told him about her mother, who had died when Eleanor was 12, and how she had learned medicine not out of passion, but out of desperate necessity, because her father had stopped functioning for nearly a year after the loss, and someone had to keep the practice alive. She had been 12 years old, mixing poultices from her mother's handwritten notebook, treating farmers' cuts and children's fevers, terrified every single day that she would make a mistake and someone would suffer for it. Thomas listened to this story without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't offer sympathy or admiration, which she had grown tired of from other people. Instead, he said quietly, "You must have been so frightened." And that single sentence, so simple and so precise, broke something open in Eleanor that had been sealed shut for over a decade. She turned away from him so he wouldn't see her face, and he had the grace and the goodness to look out at the sea and say nothing until she was ready. They were married in September, in the small stone chapel at Harrowden, with salt wind blowing through the open doors, and Eleanor's father weeping openly in the front pew. Thomas placed on her finger a ring that had belonged to his mother, a thin brass band with a tiny garnet that was worth almost nothing in money and absolutely everything in meaning. Eleanor wore it every hour of every day after that. She wore it while she learned to navigate the vast, intimidating world of Ashworth Hall. She wore it while she struggled to earn the respect of a household staff that viewed her as an outsider, a physician's daughter playing at being a duchess. She wore it while she quietly, stubbornly, began transforming the unused east wing of the estate into a free medical clinic for the tenant families and village poor, mixing medicines herself, her duchess's gowns protected by the same rough apron she had worn in her father's cottage. Thomas adored her for it. He adored her completely, openly, in a way that made the London social set uncomfortable, because it was unfashionable for a duke to so obviously love his own wife. But Thomas had a cousin. His name was Philip Ashworth, and he was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth, but never with his eyes. Philip was next in line for the estate and the title, and he had spent 7 years waiting for Thomas to remain unmarried and produce no heir, which would have eventually delivered everything into Philip's manicured hands. Eleanor's arrival shattered that expectation. Philip watched Eleanor with the careful, patient attention of a man counting the days until he could act. 11 months into the marriage, Eleanor fell suddenly and violently ill. The symptoms were strange, inconsistent, things that didn't fit neatly into any diagnosis her trained mind could identify. Waves of nausea that came only after evening meals, trembling in her hands that worsened each week, a metallic taste on her tongue that she couldn't wash away. Her father traveled to Ashworth Hall and examined her with growing alarm, whispering to Thomas that he could find no natural cause and that the progression of symptoms was unlike any disease he had encountered in 30 years of practice. It was the metallic taste that saved Eleanor's life. She had read her mother's medical notebook so many times that the pages had gone soft as cloth, and somewhere in the back of her memory, a passage surfaced, written in her mother's careful hand, about the signs of arsenic introduced slowly into food. The metallic taste, the trembling, the nausea, tied specifically to meals. Someone in Ashworth Hall was poisoning her. Eleanor told no one, except her father, not even Thomas, because the horrible, twisting truth that she could not yet face was this: she did not know whether her husband was involved. She loved him with every fiber of her being, but she had seen the way Philip whispered to Thomas in the study, had noticed the subtle shifts in Thomas's behavior over recent weeks, the way he sometimes looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, something caught between tenderness and guilt. She couldn't be sure, and in a house where someone was slowly killing her, being unsure of anyone was the same as being sure of no one. So Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Lenfield, did the only thing her survival instinct and her medical training would allow. She planned her own death. She stopped eating the food served to her, secretly sustaining herself on bread and apples smuggled from the village by her father. She mimicked the worsening symptoms she knew arsenic would produce. She prepared a sleeping draught so powerful it would slow her heartbeat to nearly nothing, making her appear, to any physician who examined her, convincingly and irreversibly dead. On the night of October the 11th, she drank the draught, and the household of Ashworth Hall woke the next morning to find the young duchess cold and still in her bed. 3 days later, she stood at the back gate of the estate in a servant's disguise, very much alive, watching the black-draped carriages arrive for her funeral. She needed to get inside that house one final time. She needed to find the evidence that would reveal who had been poisoning her. and she needed to look into the eyes of every person in that chapel and determine, once and for all, whether the man she loved had wanted her dead. She adjusted her servant's cap, steadied her breathing, and walked through the gate. "You're right. Let me rewrite part 2, with a fully grounded, realistic tone. No ghost metaphors, just raw human tension and real-world stakes." Part 2. The servant who knew too much Eleanor had spent 3 days hidden in her father's rented room above the village bakery in Harrowden, recovering from the sleeping draught that had nearly killed her for real. The dosage had been dangerously precise. Her mother's notebook had described the mixture in careful detail, but her mother had also written a warning in the margin, underlined twice: 1/4 spoon beyond the measure, and sleep becomes death. Eleanor had measured the powder with hands that trembled so badly she had to set the spoon down twice and breathe slowly before she trusted herself to continue. When she finally drank it, mixed into warm milk to mask the bitter chalk taste, she had looked at the brass ring on her finger and whispered Thomas's name, because if she had made an error, and this was truly the end, she wanted his name to be the last word she ever spoke. She had woken 31 hours later in her father's arms, gasping, disoriented, her muscles so weak she could not lift her own head. Her father, David Caldwell, was not a man given to displays of emotion. He had delivered hundreds of babies, set countless broken bones, and held the hands of dying patients with steady, professional calm. But when Eleanor opened her eyes, his face was wet, and his hands were shaking, and he said in a voice she had never heard from him before, "Don't you ever do that to me again." It took 2 full days before Eleanor could stand without assistance. During that time, her father brought her news from Ashworth Hall in quiet, careful fragments, as though he were feeding information to a patient who might not be strong enough to receive it. The household believed she was dead. The physician who had examined her, a man named Dr. Harwell who had been summoned from the neighboring county, had declared her deceased without suspicion. The body, which was actually a carefully weighted and sealed coffin that Eleanor's father had argued should remain closed due to the ravages of her supposed illness, was being kept in the chapel. The funeral was set for October the 14th, and Thomas, her father told her gently, had not left her bedroom since the morning they had found her. Eleanor received this information sitting on the edge of the narrow cot, wrapped in a rough blanket, staring at the floor. She did not cry. She pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger, a habit she had developed as a girl when she needed to stay focused during a difficult medical procedure, and she asked her father the question that had been eating through her like acid for weeks. "Do you believe he knew?" David Caldwell sat down heavily in the only chair in the room. He was 61 years old and looked, in that moment, like a man of 80. He rubbed his face with both hands and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have watched Thomas Ashworth sit beside your bed for 11 days while you deteriorated. I watched him spoon broth into your mouth with his own hands. I watched him fall asleep in a chair beside you and wake with a start every time you shifted in your sleep. I do not believe that man is capable of harming you." He paused. "But I am your father, and I believed your mother would live to see old age. I have been wrong about the people I loved before, and the cost of being wrong nearly destroyed me. So I will not tell you to trust anyone in that house until we have proof." Proof. That was what Eleanor needed, and it was what she could only find inside Ashworth Hall. The plan was simple in its design and terrifying in its execution. Eleanor's father had contacts among the village tradespeople who regularly supplied the estate. A woman named Agnes Whitmore, a widow who ran a small domestic employment service in the market town 6 miles west, owed David Caldwell a deep personal debt. 15 years earlier, he had treated her son for a fever that 3 other physicians had declared fatal, sitting beside the boy's bed for 2 straight nights, adjusting the treatment hour by hour until the fever broke. Agnes had never forgotten it. When David asked her to forge a letter of reference for a kitchen maid named Mary Linton, she did not ask a single question. She simply wrote the letter in her best hand, pressed her official seal into the wax, and handed it to David with a look that said she understood the gravity of what she was doing, and accepted it. Eleanor practiced being Mary Linton for the 2 days of her recovery. She changed her posture, rounding her shoulders and dropping her chin, making herself physically smaller. She altered her walk, shortening her stride and softening her step into the quiet, self-erasing movement of a woman trained since childhood to occupy as little space as possible. She removed the brass ring from her finger and sewed it carefully into the hem of her skirt, because she could not bear to leave it behind, but could not risk anyone recognizing it. She rubbed dirt into her fingernails and rough kitchen salt into her palms to create the calluses that a real servant's hands would carry. She practiced speaking in the slower, broader accent of the Western villages, dropping the clipped, educated pronunciation that would immediately mark her as something other than what she claimed to be. On the morning of October the 14th, she stood at the back gate of her own estate and felt a fear so physical it was almost like being ill again. Her stomach clenched, her vision narrowed. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, fast and shallow, and for a terrible moment, she considered turning around, walking back to the village, and simply disappearing. She could go to London under a false name. She could take a ship to France. She could start over and leave all of this behind. The poisoning, the suspicion, the suffocating uncertainty about the man she loved. But Eleanor Caldwell had been 12 years old when her mother died, and her father fell apart, and she had not run then. She had picked up her mother's notebook and taught herself medicine, and kept an entire practice alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let the worst thing that had ever happened to her be the thing that defined her. She was not a woman who ran. She was a woman who walked directly into the thing she feared most, and dealt with it using her hands and her mind, and whatever tools were available. She pushed open the gate and walked through. The kitchen was overwhelming. Eleanor had eaten meals that came from this kitchen for 11 months, but she had never stood inside it during a major household event. The heat from the ovens hit her face like a wall. The noise was constant, a clatter of pots and pans, the sharp voices of senior staff issuing instructions, the hiss of steam, and the heavy thud of bread dough being worked on floured wooden boards. The smell was dense and layered, roasted meat and fresh herbs, and the sharp sweetness of pastry glaze, and, beneath it all, the faint iron scent of the well water that the kitchen used for washing. Mrs. Garrick, the kitchen steward, was a tall woman with steel-gray hair, pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. Eleanor had interacted with her dozens of times as Duchess, and each interaction had carried the particular stiffness that Mrs. Garrick reserved for a mistress she considered unqualified for the position. Now, standing before the same woman as a servant, Eleanor experienced something remarkable. Mrs. Garrick looked directly at her face, examined the forged letter for roughly 10 seconds, asked if she could carry heavy trays without dropping them, and upon receiving Eleanor's quiet, "Yes, ma'am," assigned her to the reception hall, and never looked at her face again. Eleanor spent the next 2 hours carrying trays of cold meats, bread, cheese, and wine to the long tables set up in the great reception hall where mourners would gather after the chapel service. She moved carefully, keeping her head down, her steps measured, performing every task with the quiet efficiency of a competent servant who wanted no attention. And she listened. The mourners arrived in waves. First, the local families, tenant farmers and village merchants, who came in their best clothes and spoke about Eleanor with genuine sadness. An older woman named Mrs. Bracken, whose grandson Eleanor had treated for a badly infected cut just 2 months ago, using a honey and herb poultice from her mother's notebook, stood by the hall entrance and wept so openly that her husband had to guide her to a chair. Eleanor saw this from across the room and had to set down the tray she was carrying because her hands had begun to shake. Then came the county families, wealthier and more reserved, offering condolences with the practiced formality of people who attended funerals, the way they attended dinner parties. And finally the London guests, Philip Ashworth's circle, men and women in exquisite mourning clothes, who spoke about Eleanor with the particular brand of sympathy that barely conceals satisfaction. It was among this last group that Eleanor heard the first thing that made her blood turn cold. She was pouring wine at a side table when two men she did not recognize stood nearby, speaking in the low, confident tones of people who assumed servants were furniture. One of them, a tall man with a narrow face and a gold watch chain draped across his waistcoat, said to the other, "Philip will move quickly now. He has already spoken to the solicitor about the inheritance terms. If Thomas has no heir within the statutory period, the title and the estate revert to the next male line." The second man, shorter and heavier, swirled his wine and said, "And if Thomas remarries?" The tall man smiled. It was a thin, knowing smile that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Philip has considered that possibility as well. I don't believe it will be a concern." Eleanor set the wine bottle down on the table with exaggerated care, because the alternative was dropping it. Her mind, trained by years of medical diagnosis to identify patterns and draw conclusions from scattered symptoms, was working furiously. Philip had already contacted the solicitor. Philip had considered the possibility of Thomas remarrying and was not concerned about it. The implication was as clear as a diagnosis confirmed by 3 separate tests. Philip had not merely benefited from her death, he had arranged it, and his confidence about Thomas's future suggested that if Thomas became an obstacle, Philip was prepared to arrange something further. She needed to find the evidence. She needed to find where the arsenic had come from, who had administered it, and how Philip had orchestrated the entire thing from within the household. And she had perhaps 6 hours before the funeral ended. The temporary staff was dismissed, and Mary Linton would be expected to walk back to the village and disappear. Eleanor picked up her tray, steadied her breathing, and walked toward the east corridor, where Philip Ashworth's guest chambers were located. She had 6 hours. She intended to use every single one of them. Part 3. The ring, the proof, and the duchess who refused to die. Eleanor knew the layout of the east corridor better than almost anyone in the household. During her 11 months as duchess, she had personally overseen the renovation of 3 guest rooms in that wing, selecting fabrics and approving paint colors, and arguing with the estate carpenter about whether the window frames needed replacing or simply resealing. She knew which doors creaked. She knew which floorboards were loose, and she knew that Philip Ashworth always stayed in the corner room at the far end, the largest of the guest chambers, because he had once made a pointed comment at dinner about how the room had been his father's, and therefore felt like a birthright rather than a courtesy. The chapel service was underway. Eleanor could hear the faint, low sound of the minister's voice carrying across the courtyard, muffled by stone walls and distance, but still recognizable in its solemn rhythm. Almost every member of the household and every guest was inside that chapel right now, sitting in ordered rows, mourning a woman who was currently climbing the servants' staircase, with a tray of clean linens pressed against her chest as cover. If anyone stopped her, she was simply delivering fresh towels to the guest rooms, a perfectly ordinary task that no one would question from a temporary kitchen maid trying to be useful. No one stopped her. The east corridor was completely empty. Eleanor set the linens down on a hall table and stepped inside Philip's room. She closed the door behind her with a soft click and stood very still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust and her breathing slow. The room smelled of Philip's cologne, a heavy, expensive scent that she had always found slightly suffocating, like flowers left too long in a closed room. His traveling trunk sat open near the wardrobe. His coat hung over the back of a chair, A writing desk near the window was covered in papers. She went to the desk first. Her father had taught her long ago that people reveal themselves most honestly in the things they write, when they believe no one will read them. She moved through the papers quickly and carefully, lifting each page by its corner, reading it, and replacing it in exactly the same position. Most of it was unremarkable. Correspondence with a London tailor, an invitation to a hunting party in November, a letter from a woman named Charlotte that was personal in nature and unrelated to Eleanor's concerns. Then she found the receipt. It was tucked between 2 pages of a letter from Philip's solicitor, almost as though it had been used as a bookmark and forgotten. It was a small, square piece of paper, slightly yellowed, printed with the heading of a chemist shop in Marbury, a town roughly 20 miles north of the estate. The receipt recorded the purchase of rat poison, a compound that Eleanor knew from her mother's notebook contained significant quantities of arsenic. The date on the receipt was August the 29th, 1842, approximately 2 weeks before Eleanor's symptoms had first appeared. The purchase had been made under a false name, but the handwriting on the signature line was unmistakably Philip's. Eleanor had seen his handwriting dozens of times on guest books and dinner cards and letters, left carelessly on side tables. The sharp, forward slanting letters were as distinctive as a fingerprint. Eleanor's hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from something harder and hotter, a fury so intense it felt like a physical substance moving through her veins. This man had poisoned her. He had watched her sicken and weaken and suffer across weeks, had sat at her dinner table and smiled at her while the arsenic he had arranged to put in her food slowly destroyed her body, and he had done it for money and a title and a house. He had reduced her entire life, her marriage, her medical work, her future, everything she was and could have been, to an obstacle between himself and an inheritance. She folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, next to the forged letter of reference. Then she continued searching. In the bottom of Philip's traveling trunk, beneath a layer of neatly folded shirts, she found something else, a small glass bottle, half empty, containing a fine white powder. She uncorked it and held it near her nose without inhaling, exactly as her father had taught her when identifying unknown substances. The faint, acrid smell was unmistakable. This was the same compound. This was the poison itself, carried in Philip's own luggage, stored casually among his clothing, as though it were tooth powder or snuff. Eleanor recorked the bottle and placed it in her apron pocket, alongside the receipt. She rearranged the shirts in the trunk to conceal the gap, straightened the papers on the desk, picked up her linens from the hall table, and walked back down the servants' staircase with the steady, unhurried steps of a woman delivering towels. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her fingertips. The chapel service ended just after noon. Eleanor stood in the reception hall as the mourners filed in, carrying a tray of wine glasses with practiced steadiness, watching faces. She watched Philip walk in first, dressed in immaculate black, his expression arranged into a mask of dignified sorrow that was so convincing Eleanor might have believed it herself if she hadn't just held the evidence of his crime in her hands. He shook hands with the minister. He placed a comforting hand on the shoulder of a weeping tenant farmer's wife. He performed grief the way a skilled actor performs a role, hitting every mark, delivering every gesture with precision. And then Thomas walked in, and Eleanor nearly dropped the tray. She had been preparing herself for this moment for 3 days, but nothing could have made her ready for the reality of it. Thomas Ashworth looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He had lost weight, visible even beneath his dark coat. His face was pale to the point of grayness, and the skin beneath his eyes was bruised purple with sleeplessness. He moved slowly, as though the air around him had thickened and every step required conscious effort. He did not speak to anyone. He did not make eye contact with anyone. He walked to a chair near the window, sat down, and stared at the floor with the blank, devastated expression of a person who has simply stopped caring whether the world continues to exist. Eleanor stood 15 feet away from him, holding a tray of wine glasses, and understood with absolute and total certainty that this man had not known. No one could perform what she was seeing. This was not grief worn for public consumption. This was the complete, structural collapse of a human being who had lost the person who mattered most to him and could not find a single reason to rebuild. His hands, resting on his knees, were trembling. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone across the room, but Eleanor could see it from where she stood, because she had held those hands 1,000 times and knew their steadiness. Those hands had held hers on the cliff paths above Harrowden. Those hands had carefully, clumsily learned to help her mix medicines in the East Wing clinic, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, while she laughed at his technique, and he pretended to be offended. Those hands had placed a brass ring with a tiny garnet on her finger, in a stone chapel by the sea, and they had been perfectly steady that day, not a single tremor, because he had been completely sure of what he was doing. Eleanor turned away from him and walked into the kitchen, because if she looked at him for one more second, she was going to cross the room and take his face in her hands, and the entire plan would be destroyed. She set the tray down on the kitchen counter and pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed. She had the evidence. She had the receipt and the bottle. She could leave right now, through the back gate, go to her father, and send word to the county magistrate. Philip would be arrested. The truth would come out. She could reveal herself to Thomas, through a letter, or through her father, or through the magistrate himself. But Eleanor thought about Thomas, sitting in that chair. She thought about the look on his face. She thought about how it would feel to learn through a letter, or a legal proceeding, that your wife was alive. To receive that information secondhand from a stranger, delivered as a fact, among other facts. And she realized that she was not willing to do that to him. She had already put him through the worst experience of his life. She would not compound it by making her return something he read about in a document. She was going to tell him herself, right now, today, whatever the risk. Eleanor untied her apron, removed the receipt and the bottle, and placed them carefully in the deep pocket of her skirt, alongside the brass ring. She pulled the servant's cap from her head and let her copper hair fall loose around her shoulders. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin and squaring her shoulders in the way that she had learned during 11 months of learning, to walk into rooms full of people who doubted she belonged there, and she walked out of the kitchen and into the reception hall. She was halfway across the room before anyone recognized her. It was Mrs. Bracken who saw her first, the old woman whose grandson Eleanor had treated, and Mrs. Bracken did not scream or faint or create a spectacle. She simply looked at Eleanor, went very still, and pressed both hands against her own mouth, with her eyes wide and filling rapidly with tears. Then the man standing next to Mrs. Bracken turned to see what she was staring at, and he recognized Eleanor too, and he dropped his wine glass. The sound of the glass breaking on the stone floor was what made the rest of the room turn and look. The silence that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of a house in mourning. It was the stunned, electric silence of 50 people, simultaneously trying to understand something that defied every rational expectation they had walked in with. Faces turned white. Mouths fell open. Someone in the back of the room made a small, choked sound that could have been either terror or wonder. Philip Ashworth's reaction was the most revealing of all. He did not go pale. He went rigid, every muscle in his body locking at once, like a man who has just heard a sound behind him in a dark alley. His eyes fixed on Eleanor, with an expression that was not shock or joy or confusion. It was calculation. It was the rapid, frantic calculation of a man whose plan has catastrophically failed, and who is already trying to determine whether there is still a way to salvage the situation. Eleanor watched that calculation happen across his face in real time, and she felt something settle in her chest, a cold, hard, satisfying certainty. She had been right, about all of it. Thomas was the last person in the room to look up. He was still sitting in the chair by the window, still staring at the floor, so deep inside his own grief that the breaking glass and the silence had barely registered. It was only when the person nearest to him touched his arm and pointed that he raised his head. Eleanor watched Thomas see her. She watched comprehension arrive in his face, the way dawn arrives over the sea at Harrowden, slowly at first, and then all at once, the gray blankness giving way to something so raw and so overwhelming that it did not look like happiness or relief or even love. It looked like a man being put back together in real time, every broken piece finding its place again, the entire architecture of a human soul reconstructing itself around a single point of focus. He stood up. The chair scraped backward across the stone floor. He took one step toward her and then stopped, as though he did not trust what he was seeing, as though he believed that if he moved too quickly, she might dissolve, and he would discover this was just another version of the dream he had surely been having every night for 3 days. Eleanor closed the distance. She walked straight to him, took his face in both her hands, and said clearly, loud enough for every person in that room to hear, "I am alive. I am here. And I need you to listen to me very carefully, because the man who tried to kill me is standing in this room." Thomas's hands came up and covered hers. His fingers were still trembling. He pressed his forehead against hers and breathed, just breathed, for 3 full seconds. And then he stepped back and looked at her, with an expression that had transformed completely. The devastation was gone. In its place was something Eleanor had seen only once before, on the day he had stood in her father's doorway with his hat in his hands, and no excuse left for visiting, and nothing to offer, except the plain, undecorated truth of who he was and what he felt. It was the look of a man who had decided something and would not be moved from it, not by convention, not by social consequence, not by anything on earth. "Tell me," he said. Eleanor reached into her pocket and produced the receipt and the glass bottle. She held them up and turned to face Philip Ashworth, who had already begun moving toward the door. But the room had shifted. The tenant farmers, the village merchants, the local families, who had known Eleanor and had been treated by her, and who had wept real tears in her chapel, these people had understood immediately what was happening, and 3 of them were now standing between Philip and the exit, not touching him, not speaking, simply standing, with the quiet, immovable solidarity of ordinary people who had decided that a wrong was going to be made right, and no one was going to leave until it was. Philip stopped. He looked at the receipt in Eleanor's hand, and for the first time, the careful composure cracked. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. His eyes darted sideways, looking for an ally in the room, and finding none. The London guests had drawn back from him, the way people instinctively draw back from a fire. Even the men who had spoken so confidently about his plans by the wine table earlier were staring at the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Thomas did not shout. He did not make threats. He walked to where Philip stood and looked at his cousin with an expression of such profound, quiet devastation that Philip actually flinched. Thomas said, in a voice that barely carried across the room, "She was your family too, Philip." Philip said nothing. There was nothing to say. The magistrate was sent for within the hour. The investigation that followed confirmed everything Eleanor had discovered. Philip had purchased the arsenic and arranged for it to be introduced into Eleanor's evening meals through a junior kitchen maid named Sarah Cowell, a young woman Philip had been paying separately and threatening with dismissal and ruin if she refused to cooperate. Sarah, who was barely 17 and had been terrified beyond rational thought for weeks, confessed everything the moment she was questioned, with kindness rather than accusation. Eleanor insisted on being present during Sarah's interview and held the girl's hand through the entire confession. When it was over, Eleanor told the magistrate that Sarah was a victim, not a conspirator, and that she would testify to that effect in any proceeding. The magistrate, who had been practicing law for 30 years and thought he had seen every variety of human behavior, looked at Eleanor with an expression of undisguised admiration and agreed. Philip Ashworth was arrested, tried, and convicted. He spent the remainder of his life in prison. He never expressed remorse. Thomas and Eleanor returned to Ashworth Hall, not as a duke and duchess performing their roles, but as two people who had been broken apart and had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of what it cost, to build something back together. Thomas never fully recovered from the 3 days he had spent believing Eleanor was dead. He carried that grief in his body for the rest of his life, a slight hesitation in his step, a habit of reaching for Eleanor's hand in any room they entered together, as though he needed to confirm through physical touch that she was still real, and still present, and still his. Eleanor understood this need, because she carried something similar, not grief, but a fierce, protective awareness that love was not a permanent condition, guaranteed by ceremony or law, but something that had to be actively maintained and defended every single day. She reopened her clinic in the East Wing. She trained 3 young women from the village as medical assistants. She wrote her mother's recipes and treatments into a proper bound book and added her own discoveries alongside them, creating a medical reference that would eventually be used by rural physicians across 4 counties. She treated anyone who came to her door, regardless of their ability to pay, and she did it wearing the same rough apron she had always worn, with the brass ring with the tiny garnet on her finger, because some things did not need to be expensive to be priceless. Thomas stood beside her through all of it, not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her, grinding herbs when she needed herbs ground, carrying supplies when supplies needed carrying, and sitting quietly in the corner of the clinic on the days when all she needed was to know he was there. They lived long lives. They raised children who knew the story of how their mother had walked into her own funeral and walked out with the truth. And on the mantelpiece of their bedroom at Ashworth Hall, next to a portrait of Eleanor's mother and a worn leather-bound medical notebook with pages soft as cloth, sat a single brass ring with a tiny garnet, worth almost nothing in money, and absolutely everything in meaning.